Welcome to The Explainer. All right, let's dive right into this deeply moving poem by the Malaysian-born Chinese-American poet Shirley Geok-lin Lim. We're going to completely unpack the emotional and literally physical erosion of a father as depicted in her work, My Father's Sadness. It's a gorgeous, tragic, and intensely layered piece of literature, and our goal today is to explain clearly how family, duty, and loss all weave together into one profound story. So, to make sure we explain clearly, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the burden of fatherhood, decode some dense metaphors of sacrifice, examine the Stoic Asian patriarch, look at the physical and emotional decay in the text, and finally wrap up by viewing it all through a feminist post-colonial lens. Let's get into it.
Starting right off with Section 1, the burden of fatherhood, and what we're calling a dreamscape of empathy.
Now, to really grasp things at the microscopic level, we have to understand the author. Lim is a brilliant memoirist and scholar who emigrated from Malaysia to the U.S. You might know her for her deep explorations of diaspora, gender, and cultural identity. But what's absolutely vital here is how heavily she draws from her own family dynamics, something you'll also see in her memoir, Among the White Moon Faces. She's taking her own profound personal grief and using it to critique the much broader immigrant experience of sacrifice. And honestly, this brilliantly sets up the core conflict right from the poem's opening lines. She writes, "My father's sadness appears in my dreams. His young body is dying of responsibility." Notice what's happening there? The father's vitality isn't being stolen by old age or, some physical illness. No, he is metaphorically killed by his patriarchal duties. It establishes this incredibly powerful dreamscape where responsibility itself is literally a fatal condition. Moving on to Section 2, Metaphors of Sacrifice, where we'll be decoding the imagery. So, Lim uses these incredibly dense, almost surreal metaphors to show us a kind of feudal generosity. One of the absolute most striking lines invokes dragon's teeth rising in the instance of his lifetime. It's a vivid, aggressive visual, right? Well, to really understand the weight of this phrase, we have to look at the classical reference she's making here. The crucial point is that she's alluding to the ancient Greek myth of Cadmus. If you remember, in this myth, sown dragon's teeth sprout straight out of the ground as fully armed warriors. Lim is using this to symbolize something deeply tragic, endless, uncontrollable, and self-destructive progeny that ultimately overwhelmed their own creator. It shows us, very clearly, how the father's lifetime yields this overwhelming flood of familial demands that actually battle against him rather than supporting him. And this theme just keeps building. We get the lines, "So many men and women march out of his mouth each time he opens his heart for fullness, he is shot down." Think about that. Every single time this father opens his heart to speak or share or even just aspire to some kind of personal fullness, his very words birth more dependence. They're just like those mythological soldiers. And the result? His own vitality is violently silenced, literally shot down by the exact life he's trying to sustain. It's a completely tragic cycle. That brings us to Section 3, the Stoic Asian patriarch and the trap of cultural identity. Let's zoom out a bit to the broader cultural framework. Lim writes, "He is an Oriental. He claims paternity." Now, by specifically calling him an Oriental, Lim deliberately shines a spotlight on the racialized stereotypes of the Stoic Asian patriarch. His cultural claim to fatherhood is the exact thing that traps him in a cycle of self-denial. His entire identity gets consumed by his role as a provider, leaving basically zero room for his own individual self. You really have to notice the tragic contrast here between the father's waking reality and his dream state. In his waking reality, his individuality is just totally stifled by Oriental duty and this crushing burden of paternity. But then, look at the dream state. The poem describes him as having a young body with only his life before him. In his dreams, he's finally free from that self-denial. He's longing for his lost potential, which is such a stark, heartbreaking contrast to his stifled waking life. And the crazy part is, the impact of all this doesn't stop with the father. The speaker says, "My father's sadness masks my face. His desires drum in my chest." The speaker is actually internalizing this cultural trauma. The boundaries between the father and the daughter completely blur in this visceral, symbiotic empathy. His unfulfilled desires literally become a physical drumming sensation in her own chest. Okay, moving into Section 4, Physical and Emotional Decay, or the Anatomy of Exhaustion. As we get into the second stanza, we start to see this tactile, really irreversible deterioration.
The speaker describes tensing like a young man with a full moon and no woman in sight. Lim is using the image of a full moon to represent potency, virility, and this deep, deep longing that goes entirely unmet. So the physical tension this speaker is feeling perfectly mirrors the father's own frustrated virility and his agonizing loss of self.
Then the imagery of decay becomes intensely physical. Lim writes that his body broke with each child, finer and finer, the clay of his body crumbling to a drizzle of silicone in the hourglass. This is such a powerful contrast between two very distinct materials. On one side, we have biblical clay, representing the natural, organic human form. On the other side, silicone, a brittle, cheap, completely artificial modern substitute. We're watching organic human life erode into artificial dust as time just relentlessly trickles away. All right, let's explain clearly what this dense string of similes at the end of the poem actually means in literal terms. First, Lim compares him to a bull under the axle, meaning an overtaxed beast of burden literally crushed by the weight it pulls. Next, he's the mangrove netted by lianas, a deeply entangled, suffocating tree trapped by vines. And finally, he's the host perishing of its lavishness. This perfectly illustrates a tragic, parasitic giving, where the host dies simply because it provided too much. He is systematically broken down by his own generosity. Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, a feminist post-colonial lens and its theoretical impact. Zooming all the way out, Lim's entire body of work frequently examines multiculturalism, the intense toll of migration, and hybrid identities. But what makes this specific poem so fascinating theoretically is how it intersects feminist and post-colonial theory. By using a female speaker's voice to meticulously dissect male sacrifice, she is brilliantly subverting traditional patriarchal narratives. Think about it. Usually, patriarchal structures silence women, but here, the female voice is the one amplifying and mourning the father's lost potential amid a culture that demands unending stoic endurance. And, the very structure of the poem reinforces this meaning. The text is written in a raw, free verse structure. This total lack of rigid traditional poetic form amplifies the intimacy of the piece. It strips away all the formalities and makes this academic and cultural critique feel incredibly personal and deeply tragic, perfectly framing his lavishness as a fatal excess. Lim ends her poem with a devastating rhetorical lament. How hard it is to be a father. We've seen exactly how duty, cultural stereotypes, and literal physical exhaustion erode the self. So it really leaves us to wonder, and I'm going to leave you with this question to ponder, how much of our true, vibrant potential is masked and ultimately lost forever by the crushing weight of cultural expectations. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.